Good Sunday morning. Hope everybody's awake and had breakfast or having breakfast. We're going to continue our Sunday school classes about King David. The lesson this week is Saul tries to kill David, and we're coming from 1 Samuel chapter 19, verses 1 through 12. I want to start a little bit on this lesson and just give you a little bit of information, but then we're going to go back and we're going to review a little bit of the stuff that we talked about. But this week, David is 21 years old when we're talking about these things that are happening to him. And if you think about David's life and what's happened already in his life for a 21-year-old boy, he has really had a lot of adventure, learning in his young life lessons that the Lord has given him that's going to take him forth throughout his life and as he becomes king of a great nation. Our lesson aim for the day, it says, sin destroys our peace and happiness and ever leads us downward. And a couple things I wanted to read for you before we recap are things that I want you to really pay attention to on this lesson and to look and things that the Lord does. When we study these lessons, you know, these things happened a long time ago to people, but they're all relevant to our life now, and what we all need to do is to look and as we do every lesson and to say how this pertains to me, because it does pertain to all of us. And if we look and we all, you know, the Lord takes us through learning experiences in our life, and sometimes we wonder why we're going through something. But I want to tell you a couple things here. It says, whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth and scourgeth every son who he receiveth. Sorrow gives the deepest and sweetest tone to our sympathy, and we are polished by sharp friction. So, you know, we look at some things that diamonds, you know, you hear diamonds in the rough, but for a diamond to become beautiful, they polish these diamonds and they grind them and they form them into the most beautiful aspect that they can have. And that's what the Lord does. Sometimes we have lessons and sometimes we really feel sorry for ourselves because of the things we're going through. And it says sorrow gives the deepest and sweetest tone to our sympathy. Sometimes if we haven't lived through something ourselves, we don't have a lot of sympathy when people do that. We kind of have a hard edge and we don't realize, or we don't have any feelings for what they're going through. Then sometimes the Lord puts us through these things, and you know, you can witness to people better if you walked in their shoes than you can if you don't have any sympathy toward them, or maybe just don't even know how they feel. And it says, look at Saul and the case of David, its hopelessness. Look beyond him and see how by a way that he knew not the shepherd was being trained to be mighty among kings and chief of all who sing the praises of God. So David has gone, and as we study farther, David's going to go through a whole lot of stuff as he goes through his life, a lot of hard stuff, living to save his life every day. But the Lord is training him up to be a great king, and all these things that he goes through is going to help him to become the king that the Lord has put in place. You know, if we look back, when Saul was chosen, he was the big, strong, warrior-looking man that was chosen for king that the people had asked for. Saul had zero training for what he did, and it didn't take Saul long before he fell and he didn't live up to the position of king that he should have grown up to be. You know, he really relied on his own self and his own strength, and he wasn't willing to wait on the Lord. When he decided to do something, it was what he decided to do, and he had no intention, because he became real puffed up and arrogant. And I want us to, as we study through these whole lessons, you know, David was always the Lord considered David a man after his own heart. And we need to look real close at David and see what he did and see the things that that he did that caused him to be called this, because that should be something that we should all strive to be, somebody that God considers very close to him, and that he can trust, and that he knows that the decisions we make will be the ones that he would have us to make. So, but like I said, our lesson starts in 1 Samuel 19, and our last lesson ended up in chapter 17. So there's a little bit of things that happen in between. So I want to go back and kind of pick up things that have been going on. If we recall, last week I talked about when David was 15 years old, he was anointed as king of Israel. And this was done between Samuel and his family came and anointed him. And if we remember, David wasn't the biggest, strongest man that the people thought would have been chosen to be king, as Saul had been. So David's done this, but even as he's anointed king, he went back to his flock, and he continued to be shepherd. He didn't go directly to become king because Saul was king at the time. And in fact, it was a really dangerous thing that he had been anointed if Saul had found out that he had been anointed. And we remember last week we talked about David when he went out to the battleground where the Israelites and the Philistines were kind of at a stalemate. And remember, they were at the different opposite sides of the valley, and Goliath would come out daily, and he would taunt the Israelites and say, "Send a man out against me. Nobody can defeat me." And they didn't have anybody. They were all scared, and they just continued to sit there until David, the 19-year-old shepherd boy, just happened to come to bring some food to his brothers. And he said, can I go out against him? And remember that he didn't take any armor. He wasn't able to wear Saul's big armor because it was too big. But he took the shepherd stones, the things that he had trained with his whole life being a shepherd, the things that the Lord had used him, had given him as his weapons. And he depended on the Lord. And if you recall, the very first thing that we talked about last week before we started was when David was anointed as king. It said that the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power. So we know that's what gave David at that time the wherewithal to go against this giant when he was just a young, inexperienced boy and he had never been in battle before. So we're going to start at chapter 18. Verse 2 says, "From that day Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his father's house." So he asked, after that battle, it's like, who is this boy that came and who is his father? And he asked if David could stay with him. And David played musical instruments, a harp, I think, that kind of soothed Saul. Saul had a really unrest in his soul. He had done a lot of, he'd been in a lot of battle, and he had done a lot of things, and he had done a lot of things against the Lord too. And he didn't have any peace anymore. And David was able to give him that when he played for him. And after David had defeated, it says that Saul gave David a high rank in his army. So it seemed like he had taken David in, and David was still doing for Saul, and Saul was, in place of that, he was giving David rank in his army. But when they came back from slaying the Philistines, the people, they were shouting for the joy, but they said, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s." And it says in verse 9 of chapter 18, "And from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David." So, even though Saul knew what he had done for the Israelites, in one sense, he saw, the battle was won through David, he became jealous of him. That just, your own nature, sometimes even though people are on your team and doing for you, there becomes a jealousy that starts growing, and that's what happened. And it says that in verse 10, Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saving himself. I'll pin David to the wall, but David eluded him twice. So this man that had helped Saul win battles had gone out and was apparently very successful right after that, because he gave him a high rank in his army. He played music for Saul to soothe him and to help him. But Saul became jealous, and he started trying to kill him. And as David was playing, Saul hurled his javelin at him. And you know Saul would have been very precise when he did this, because he was trained at battle. But he missed David. And we know that the Lord was always watching David, and that he helped him to do this. In verse 12, and pay close attention to this, says Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had left Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men. And David led the troops in their campaigns. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them. So we can see Saul's own country is beginning to love David. And it seems like everything David touches is golden. He had the Lord behind him. The Lord was helping him. The Lord was giving him victories over the people that he was fighting. And Saul offered David his oldest daughter to be married. And David was humble. And that's one thing we need to look at David real closely. And he says, who am I that I should be the king's son-in-law? And so Saul gave his daughter to another man. But then Saul's daughter Michal actually loved David. And Saul realized that, and he thought that he could give Michal to David to be a snare for him. So he offered Michal, and again, David's like, I don't have any money. I'm a poor man. I don't have a dowry. I don't have anything to give. So Saul said, if you go out and kill 100 Philistines, that would be your dowry toward that. And David in turn went out and killed 200 and brought him back. And so he was given Michal as his wife. But everything that Saul's trying to do to snare David seems to be backfiring on him. And I want to look again in verse 28 of chapter 18. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David, that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. So the man that could have really helped him to be a better king and was defeating enemies for him, he has chosen to be an enemy of David. So that's where we are now. So he's actually trying to has given David a wife that he's trying to use against him. So we're going to start in chapter 19, verses 1. And it says, and Saul spake to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. So he's put out a hit on David pretty much. And when the king does it, and puts all his people against David, David doesn't have, in our earthly way, he doesn't have a lot of chance. They don't have airplanes they can get on and fly off, or any quick means of escape from them. And a lot of people were going to be loyal to the king, and once they told this, and he also told his son Jonathan that we wanted to kill David. And the book says, and it's something that I hadn't thought of, it's real, it says, the malignant jealousy of Saul appears to have sprung up almost immediately after the slaughter of Goliath, but it calling it the malignant jealousy. And if you think of jealousy, that's a great word for it, because it's kind of like a cancer. It starts out small, and it keeps festering and festering and getting larger. And after a certain point, without the Lord's help, there's really no turning back from it. Once you get this jealousy in your heart, everything you see and every situation seems to lend to be a part of that, and it kind of snowballs and it gets bigger and worse. And where they're chanting, Saul has killed his thousands and David 10,000. Saul keeps that in his heart, and he's getting very angry because of it. And he even says, what can he have more but the kingdom? So, this kingdom is what is first in his life. And, we always want to put the Lord first and things afterwards, and he gives us perspective in all we have. But Saul has let that give backwards, and this kingdom and this kingship is his whole life consists of at this point. And now he sees a man that the people are looking forward and that they're looking to as a potential leader. But we know David is going through this, and David's learning the hard way these things. In the lesson it says, if Saul had been a good man, he would have been horrified at the appearance of this evil passion in his heart. He would have said, get thee behind me, Satan. So, when you first start feeling these feelings of jealousy or whatever, if you don't start to get rid of it at the beginning, because it's small, it might be small at the beginning, but it's going to snowball as things happen. As our mind, then our mind we start reading things into stuff that might not be true, and it gets bigger, and the jealousy gets worse till there's hardly no turning back from it. It says in here, the next stage in the career of jealousy is to ally itself with cunning under the pretense of great generosity. So, he started having David to come into his home to play music for him. He got his daughter. He made him, a high ranking in his army. He sent him out to battles. So Saul is setting David up. He acts like he loves him and wants to be a part of it. But he's, his intent, he wants David to die. And he even gave the daughter to him that he would die. I had read this before the lesson started to our preacher. It said, Saul became gloomy, crafty, and cruel. And that's what, if you think about it, that's exactly what jealousy does to us. We become gloomy, crafty, and cruel. We lose all our sympathy, all of our maybe love that we had once had for that person that we become jealous of. It really turns us into a mean, bitter person. Even though, sometimes the person that it's toward doesn't even realize it, that it's just festering in the other. So, okay, chapter 19, verse 2. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, saying, Saul, my father seeketh to kill thee. Now, for I pray thee, take heed to thyself until the morning, and abide in a secret place, and hide thyself. So, Jonathan is just the opposite of his father. Because if you think of the way kingships go, once Saul has lived out his life and he's no longer king, Jonathan would be next in line to become king. So Jonathan's got a lot riding on David and the love of the people for David. But it says, Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. Jonathan, they became like brothers. They became even closer than brothers. And even though Jonathan was aware that David was real likely, because of the love of the people, to have the kingdom, he wasn't after that. Jonathan loved David. So he went to him and he told him, my dad's after you, and you really need to hide until morning, until I get back with you. And he says in verse 3, and I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where thou art, and I will commune with my father of thee, and what I see, that I will tell thee. So David's going to go out and hide close enough that he can, have some contact or can see and maybe even hear what's going on, but at least that Jonathan can kind of give him some signal of either get out of town or everything's going to be okay. And it says in verse 4, And Jonathan spake good of David unto Saul his father, and said unto him, Let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he had not sinned against thee, and because his works have been to thee were very good. So Jonathan's trying to talk sense into his dad. It's like, don't hate this man. Look what he's done for us. He's never done anything for you. Why are you doing this to him? And sometimes, when jealousy springs up, if somebody can talk to us and, and reason with us, if we're willing to listen and see the facts that they can lay out for us. And Jonathan also says in verse 5, For he did put his life in his hand and slew the Philistine, and the Lord wrought a great salvation for all Israel. Thou sawest it, and didst rejoice. Wherefore then wilt thou sin against innocent blood to slay David without a cause? So he's bringing stuff back up to him. He said, hey, remember what he did when Goliath was out in the field and when your whole army was standing there and afraid to do anything? And why would you kill this man that has done so much? And it's innocent blood. He's telling him, well, he's done nothing for you. So he's really wanting to talk to Saul and for him to hear, when you do this, you're doing it against an innocent man. Verse 6 says, And Saul hearkened unto the voice of Jonathan, and Saul sware, As the Lord liveth, he shall not be slain. So Jonathan was able to sway his dad and to make him realize that he didn't do anything against you, that you're doing this, that this is all in your mind, in your heart. So he, the king has sworn an oath. Says, And Jonathan called David, and Jonathan showed him all these things. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as in times past. So we see here that Jonathan was able to calm Saul down, to remind him what David had done, and that David had done this for him, and that they were able to come back together, and that they were able to be like they were in times past. Verse 8 says, And there was war again, and David went out and fought with the Philistines, and slew them with a great slaughter, and they fled from him. So David's at it again. He's doing, what he seems to be best at. And there was a great slaughter, and they fled. So, David has conquered. And the evil spirit from the Lord was upon Saul, and he sat in his house with his javelin in his hand, and David played with his hand. So David's still back in the king's presence, and he has once again gone to battle and won. But Saul has just got this unrest in his soul. And it's verse 10, And Saul sought to smite David even to the wall with the javelin, but he slipped away out of Saul's presence, and he smote the javelin into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. So David's sitting there playing an instrument, and Saul picks up his javelin and hurls it to try to kill David, to pin him to the wall, it says. And when I read this and it says he slipped out, a lot of David's life that mirrors what happens to Jesus when he's on earth. I remember when Jesus, there were times that they were trying to capture him, and he would be in a place that it would seem like in one of the temples that they would be able to get their hands on him, but Jesus was always able to slip away. His time yet wasn't come.
A few minutes too short.
Yes, and they were always not there, and it seems like that the Lord's watching over David and giving him this same ability. Verse 11 says, Saul also sent messengers unto David's house to watch him and to slay him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, If thou save not thy life tonight, tomorrow thou shalt be slain. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. So Saul's not, he wants him dead. He wasn't able to get him with the javelin, so he's going to go to his house and get him, because he figured when David fled from that point that he went home. But Michal, David's wife, who Saul sent to try to trap him, and he thought that his daughter would be on his side and help him. She's helping David. The guards are watching David's door to watch him to come out in the morning, but she helps him to slip down through a window and get out. So at this point, I'll read this to you. It says, with this desperate flight began those long, weary wanderings, those perpetual risks of his life, which went on until the death of King Saul released David from his deadly enemy. So from this point on, David's on the run and Saul's after him. He's, you know, wherever he goes, Saul's taking his army. And you know, sometimes, and you think, okay, you said earlier that the Lord was with David, and why is he, you know, why isn't he having this great life, and why is he in the palace? But as we had talked, I told you at the first of the lesson, we are polished by sharp friction, and David was polished by sharp friction. We're going to study more of David's life and what he went through, but this time David was on the run. You know, he was newly married at the time. He has to run and leave his wife, and he has to live anywhere he can live at this point. He goes to Samuel, who anointed him to be king, and seeks some refuge with him when he leaves here. But we'll continue to study more of what happened to him at this point. But we see, you know, David's life isn't easy. But we just want to look at David's character and how David doesn't become bitter, and David doesn't do all these things that Saul has done. Let's go through some of the questions real quick to discuss. It says, why was Saul jealous of David? You all want to answer one, Peter?
You can start, I can
Okay. Saul was jealous because David had killed his 10,000s, or the people were, you know, chanting, Saul has killed thousands and David is 10,000. So, you know, David was getting the love of the people, I think, is the bottom line of he was. And, you know, and that's what you have to do as king. Saul had been king. He had the allegiance of the people for years, and David's come in very quick time.
That's what I was going to say.
And has taken that from him. And it says, in what secret ways did he try to cause David's death?
And
You know,
Saul puts David in harm's way many times out in battlefields. He tries to get his son to lure him in and kill him, you know, have someone kill him. It's just...
Saul has plan A, B, C, and D.
He tries to do it without doing it himself.
Right. He wants it done, but he wants it. He appears to like David, but
He wants to keep his hands clean.
yeah. Why did Saul expect Jonathan to help kill David?
Because it's his son, and he thinks his son's loyal to him. He don't know that his son is, you know, a friend with David.
As friend, and you know, and Jonathan has as much or more to lose as anybody, because he would be the future king. So aligned with David, Jonathan's given up his kingship to the land. It says, are people still tempted to seek sacrifices for personal interest?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's all about number one.
That's where that jealousy kicks in.
Yes. You lose sight of what somebody was, or the friendship. You only see the jealousy.
Yeah, somebody getting more recognition than you are, then you start getting that jealousy.
And so how did Jonathan help David?
Pretty much kept him in pretty much let him know what his dad was doing.
Okay.
Pretty much let him know, you know, what was going on, if he needs to stay or flee.
Okay. What caused Saul's renewed attempts on David's life? David went out and he won some more battles.
Yeah.
And, and I think it,
And that probably right there gave him a bigger name too. Just
Yeah.
made that jealousy get more heated up.
just kept adding fuel to it.
Exactly.
Why did David have to suffer so much? What's the cause of the suffering?
One was because of the jealousy.
The jealousy. And we see the suffering on David's part, but we know, the Lord's trying to teach David to mold David. Because a king is not it wouldn't be an easy job. You had the people that loved you, but then in the kingdom, you were always going to have the other people that were wanting your position. I mean, and always, doing battle to get that. And we saw even later in David's life, we'll see that David's son even does that to him. So I guess for building character in David, building a strong bond between him and God, because as we see, there's a lot of things that happened that David couldn't possibly have done by himself. And it has said that, in the Bible that the Lord was with David and that he had the Lord's power. So, yes, this will end our lesson. Hope you've learned something today. Next week we're going to talk more about David and Jonathan's relationship, and it's going to be from 1 Samuel verses 21 through 13. So if you want to read in between the rest of verse 19 up until 20 to get some of the history of what's gone on in between our lesson last week. So we'll see you next Sunday morning at 10.